The Armenian language is an Indo-European language spoken by the Armenians. It is the official language of the Republic of Armenia and the self-proclaimed Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. It has historically been spoken throughout the Armenian highlands and today is widely spoken in the Armenian diaspora. Armenian has its own unique script, the Armenian alphabet, restored in 405 CE by Mesrop Mashtots. Linguists classify Armenian as an independent branch of the Indo-European language family. It is of interest to linguists for its distinctive phonological developments within the Indo-European languages. Armenian shares a number of major innovations with Greek, and some linguists group these two languages with Phrygian and the Indo-Iranian family into a higher-level subgroup of Indo-European, which is defined by such shared innovations as the augment. More recently, others have proposed a Balkan grouping including Greek, Phrygian, Armenian, and Albanian. Armenia was a monolingual country by the 2nd century BC at the latest. Its language has a long literary history, with a 5th century Bible translation as its oldest surviving text. Its vocabulary has been heavily influenced by Western Middle Iranian languages, particularly Parthian, and to a lesser extent by Greek, Persian, and Arabic throughout its history. There are two standardized modern literary forms, Eastern Armenian and Western Armenian, with which most contemporary dialects are mutually intelligible. Classification and origins. Although the Armenians were known to history much earlier, the oldest surviving Armenian language text is the 5th century AD Bible translation of Mesrop Mashtots, who restored or created the Armenian alphabet in 405 AD, at which time it had 36 letters. He is also credited by some with the creation of the Caucasian, Albanian and Georgian alphabet. In his same 4th century BC Anabasis, Xenophon describes many aspects of Armenian village life and hospitality in around 401 BC. He relates that the Armenian people spoke a language that to his ear sounded like the language of the Persians. Early contacts. The enormous amount of loans from Iranian languages initially led linguists to erroneously classify Armenian as an Iranian language. Another reason behind this is that Armenian word forms are close to or even identical with Iranian and especially modern Persian forms in so many cases that the particular connection between the two languages could not escape the notice of scholars even at the beginning of modern Armenological studies. However, as the Encyclopedia Iranica states, such words were not at first recognized as borrowings, and as a result, in the mid-19th century experts both in Armenian and in Iranian, foremost among whom were Paul de Lagarde and F. Muller, concluded that Armenian belongs to the Iranian group of languages. The distinctness of Armenian was only recognized when Hubschmann used the comparative method to distinguish two layers of Iranian loans from the older Armenian vocabulary. W.M. Austin concluded that there was an early contact between Armenian and Anatolian languages based on what he considered common archaisms, such as the lack of a feminine and the absence of inherited long vowels. However, unlike shared innovations, the common retention of archaisms is not necessarily considered evidence of a period of common isolated development. Soviet linguist Igor Dyakonov noted the presence in Old Armenian of what he calls a Caucasian substratum, identified by earlier scholars, consisting of loans from the Kartvelian and Northeast Caucasian languages. Noting that the Hurro-Urartian peoples inhabited the Armenian homeland in the 2nd millennium BC, Dyakonov identifies in Armenian a Hurro-Urartian substratum of social, cultural, and animal and plant terms such as Alexan, slave girl, arena, Koft ult, camel, and exenjor, apple. Some of the terms he gives admittedly have an Akkadian or Sumerian provenance, but he suggests they were borrowed through Hurron or Urartian. Given that these borrowings do not undergo sound changes characteristic of the development of Armenian from Proto-Indo-European, He dates their borrowing to a time before the written record but after the Proto-Armenian language stage. Graco-Armenian hypothesis. The hypothesis that Greek is Armenians' closest living relative originates with Pedersen, who noted that the number of Greek-Armenian lexical cognates is greater than that of agreements between Armenian and any other Indo-European language. Made further investigated morphological and phonological agreement, postulating that the parent languages of Greek and Armenian were dialects in immediate geographical proximity in the parent language. Millet's hypothesis became popular in the wake of his esquisse. Salter does not go as far as postulating a Proto-Graco-Armenian stage, but he concludes that, considering both the lexicon and morphology, Greek is clearly the dialect most closely related to Armenian. Hamp supports the Graco-Armenian thesis, anticipating even a time when we should speak of Helleno-Armenian. Armenian shares the augment and a negator derived from the set phrase *h2oukwid, and the representation of word initial laryngeals by prothetic vowels, and other phonological and morphological peculiarities with Greek. Nevertheless, linguists, including Fortson, comment, by the time we reach our earliest Armenian records in the 5th century AD, the evidence of any such early kinship has been reduced to a few tantalizing pieces. Greco-Armeno-Aryan hypothesis. Graco-Aryan is a hypothetical clade within the Indo-European family, ancestral to the Greek language, the Armenian language, and the Indo-Iranian languages. Graco-Aryan unity would have become divided into Proto-Greek and Proto-Indo-Iranian by the mid-3rd millennium BC. Conceivably, Proto-Armenian would have been located between Proto-Greek and Proto-Indo-Iranian, consistent with the fact that Armenian shares certain features only with Indo-Iranian but others only with Greek. Graco-Aryan has comparatively wide support among Indo-Europeanists for the Indo-European homeland to be located in the Armenian highland. Early and strong evidence was given by Euler's 1979 examination on shared features in Greek and Sanskrit nominal flexion. Used in tandem with the Graco-Armenian hypothesis, the Armenian language would also be included under the label Aryano-Greco-Armenic, splitting into Proto-Greek, Phrygian and Armeno-Aryan. Evolution. Old or Classical Armenian borrowed numerous words from Middle Iranian languages, primarily Parthian, and contained smaller inventories of loanwords from Greek, Syriac, Arabic, Mongol, Persian, and autochthonous languages such as Eurasian. Old Armenian, attested from the 5th century to c. 1100, was superseded by Middle Armenian, attested from c. 1100 to 1700. An effort to modernize the language in Greater Armenia and the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia resulted in the addition of 2 more characters to the alphabet, bringing the total number to 38. The Book of Lamentations by Gregory of Narek is an example of the development of a literature and writing style in Middle Armenian. In addition to elevating the literary style of the Armenian language, Gregory of Narek paved the way for his successors to include secular themes in their writings. The thematic shift from mainly religious texts to writings with secular outlooks further enhanced and enriched the vocabulary. A Word of Wisdom, a poem by Hovhannes Sargavak devoted to a starling, legitimizes poetry devoted to nature, love, or female beauty. Gradually, the interests of the population at large were reflected in other literary works as well. Konstantin Yazinkatsi and several others even take the unusual step of criticizing the ecclesiastic establishment and addressing the social issues of the Armenian homeland. However, these changes altered the nature of the literary style and syntax, but they did not constitute radical changes to the fundamentals of the grammar or the morphology of the language. The Treaty of Turkmenchay of 1828, which granted for the forced cession of all of eastern Armenia from Kayar Iran into the Russian Empire, once again divided the traditional Armenian homeland. This time, Western Armenia remained under Ottoman control, whereas the other large chunk of historical Armenia, amongst which the soil of the contemporary Republic of Armenia, after centuries of Iranian rule, was ceded by Qajar Iran to neighboring Russia following the latter's victory in the Russo-Persian War of 1826–1828. The antagonistic relationship between the Russian and Ottoman empires led to creation of two separate and different environments under which Armenians lived and suffered. Halfway through the 19th century, two important concentrations of Armenian communities were constituted. Because of persecutions or the search for better economic opportunities, many Armenians living under Ottoman rule gradually moved to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, whereas Tiflis in Georgia became the center of Armenians living under Russian rule. These two cosmopolitan cities very soon became the primary poles of Armenian intellectual and cultural life. The introduction of new literary forms and styles, as well as many new ideas sweeping Europe, reached Armenians living in both regions. This created an ever-growing need to elevate the vernacular Ashkar to the dignity of a modern literary language. In contrast to the now anachronistic Grabar, numerous dialects developed in the traditional Armenian regions, which, different as they were, had certain morphological and phonetic features in common. On the basis of these features, two major variants emerged. Western variant. The influx of immigrants from different parts of the traditional Armenian homeland to Constantinople crystallized the common elements of the regional dialects, paving the way to a style of writing that required a shorter and more flexible learning curve than Grabar. Eastern variant. The dialect of the Ararat Plateau provided the primary elements of Eastern Armenian, centered in Tiflis. Similar to the Western Armenian variant, the modern Eastern was in many ways more practical and accessible to the masses than Grabar. Both centers vigorously pursued the promotion of Ashkar. The proliferation of newspapers in both versions and the development of a network of schools where modern Armenian was taught dramatically increased the rate of literacy, even in remote rural areas. The emergence of literary works entirely written in the modern versions increasingly legitimized the language's existence. By the turn of the 20th century, both varieties of the one modern Armenian language prevailed over Grabar and opened the path to a new and simplified grammatical structure of the language in the two different cultural spheres. Apart from minor morphological, phonetic, and grammatical differences, the largely common vocabulary and identical rules of grammatical fundamentals allows users of one variant to understand the other easily. After the First World War, the existence of the two modern versions of the same language was sanctioned even more clearly. The Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic used Eastern Armenian as its official language, whereas the diaspora created after the genocide of 1915 preserved the Western Armenian dialect. Modern changes. The two modern literary dialects, a Western and Eastern, removed almost all of their Turkish lexical influences in the 20th century, primarily following the Armenian genocide. Phonology. Proto-Indo-European voiceless occlusives are aspirated in Proto-Armenian, one of the circumstances that is often linked to the glottalized theory, a version of which postulated that the voiceless occlusives of Proto-Indo-European were aspirated. Stress in Armenian. The stress falls on the last syllable unless the last syllable contains e, in which case, it falls on the penultimate one. For instance, chi or k, md knows, gini, but, vh gen, and dt. Exceptions to this rule are some words with the final letter and sometimes the ordinal numerals. Vowels. Modern Armenian has 6 monophthongs. Each vowel phoneme in the table is represented by 3 symbols. The first indicates the phoneme's pronunciation in the International Phonetic Alphabet. After that appears the corresponding letter of the Armenian alphabet. The last symbol is its Latin transliteration. Consonants. The following table lists the Eastern Armenian consonantal system. The occlusives and affricates have a special aspirated series. P, T, C, K. Each phoneme in the table is represented by 3 symbols. The first indicates the phoneme's pronunciation in the International Phonetic Alphabet. After that appears the corresponding letter of the Armenian alphabet, and the last symbol is its Latin transliteration according to ISO 9985. Sources differ on the place of articulation of these consonants. The major phonetic difference between dialects is in the reflexes of classical Armenian voice onset time. The 7 dialect types have the following correspondences, illustrated with the TD series. The consonants transcribed diabreathy voiced. Morphology. Armenian corresponds with other Indo-European languages in its structure, but it shares distinctive sounds and features of its grammar with neighboring languages of the Caucasus region. Armenian is agglutinative, one of only 2 Indo-European languages with this characteristic, the other one being Persian. Armenian is rich in combinations of consonants. Both classical Armenian and the modern spoken and literary dialects have a complicated system of declining nouns, with 6 or 7 noun cases but no gender. In modern Armenian, the use of auxiliary verbs to show tense has generally supplemented the inflected verbs of classical Armenian. Negative verbs are conjugated differently from positive ones. Grammatically, early forms of Armenian had much in common with classical Greek and Latin, but the modern language, like modern Greek, has undergone many transformations. With time, the Armenian language made a transition from a synthetic language to a typical analytic language with Middle Armenian as a midpoint in this transition. Noun. Classical Armenian has no grammatical gender, not even in the pronoun, but there is a feminine suffix. For example, becomes. This suffix, however, does not have a grammatical effect on the sentence. The nominal inflection, however, preserves several types of inherited stem classes. Nouns are declined for one of 7 cases: nominative, accusative, locative, genitive, dative, ablative, or instrumental. Examples of nouns: declension. Animated nouns do not decline for locative case. Verbs in Armenian have an expansive system of conjugation with 2 main verb types changing form based on tense, mood and aspect. Dialects. Armenian is a pluricentric language, having 2 modern standardized forms: Eastern Armenian and Western Armenian. The most distinctive feature of Western Armenian is that it has undergone several phonetic mergers. These may be due to proximity to Arabic and Turkish-speaking communities. For example, Eastern Armenian speakers pronounces an aspirated T, as in tiger, like the D in develop, and as a tenuis or occlusive, sounding somewhere between the 2 as in stop. A Western Armenian has simplified the occlusive system into a simple division between voiced occlusives and aspirated ones. The first series corresponds to the tenuis, a series of Eastern Armenian, and the second corresponds to the Eastern voiced and aspirated series. There is no precise linguistic border between one dialect and another because there is nearly always a dialect transition zone of some size between pairs of geographically identified dialects. Armenian can be divided into 2 major dialectal blocks and those blocks into individual dialects, though many of the Western Armenian dialects have become extinct due to the effects of the Armenian genocide. In addition, neither dialect is completely homogeneous. Any dialect can be subdivided into several subdialects. Although Western and Eastern Armenian are often described as different dialects of the same language, some subdialects are not readily mutually intelligible. Nevertheless, a fluent speaker of one of 2 greatly varying dialects who is exposed to the other dialect for even a short period of time will be able to understand the other with relative ease. Other distinct dialects include the Homshutsai language of the Hemzem people and the divergent and almost extinct Low-Mavran language of the Bosha people, both of which are categorized as belonging to the Armenian language family. Writing system. The Armenian alphabet is a graphically unique alphabetical writing system that is used to write the Armenian language. It was introduced around 405 AD by Mesrop Mashtots, an Armenian linguist and ecclesiastical leader, and originally contained 36 letters. 2 more letters, and, were added in the Middle Ages. During the 1920s orthography reform, a new letter was added, which was a ligature before plus, whereas the letter was discarded and reintroduced as a part of a new letter. Indo-European cognates. Armenian is an Indo-European language. This table lists only some of the more recognizable cognates that Armenian shares with English language.